welcome everyone to another episode of Behind the Mic. Today we have a very special guest, someone that I've had very interesting conversations on his show, and I'm very excited to have you here. Safa, thank you so much for being here, man. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks so much for having me. Hope all's going well.
Absolutely. So, for obviously, I know your show very well, but for our listeners who still are not familiar, and they should, can you give us a bit more context on your show's revenue, the main topics to discuss, and just a bird's eye view of your podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. So the show's called Revenue, and the reason I started it's pretty simple. I've always been interested in tech and entrepreneurship, but I felt like every podcast or YouTube channel was too high level. Everyone's focusing on the summary. I'll give you a very specific example. I remember listening to How I Built This Episode by Guy Raz. And the first minute of the episode is, thanks for joining us. You're this awesome founder. And like minute 5 was, so we sold the company for $1 billion. And now we're kind of all, working for our next venture. And I'm like, wait, you skipped over the co-founder arguments, funding, first customer, getting off the ground, break even, like all these milestones were missed. And so I kind of swore to myself one day I was going to start a podcast, and it was going to be the real stories behind building companies. So what I say is we don't really focus on marketing or sales or finance or product. We focus on builders. So we talk to people who are building great companies, building great products, building great brands. That's kind of the thing that gets me really excited. And I like going deep into the weeds. So I think that's kind of where that all started from.
I love that. And so you're listening to that episode, you're like, okay, what happened between 0 and 5 billion, right? And then you're like, I want to start a podcast, and then you started right away, or how was the process of beginning that show look like?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I probably wanted to start a podcast ever since 2017, 2018, but I always told myself, I'm not ready yet. I don't know enough. I'm not charismatic. I'm not smart enough, right? You have all that self-doubt creep in, right? So I told myself like, okay, when the company's big and we have a head of marketing, maybe her and I will start a podcast together, right? It's like this partnership where the company's 20 people and we can start a podcast once we're somebody. Right. And then the pandemic happens, the lockdown happens, and I'm just sitting at home. And I'm like, wait, every interesting person is also sitting at home. Why don't I just call them? And it really started very quickly. It was, okay, maybe 2022, 23, we'll start a podcast. And then the lockdown happens. And I just said, why don't we do it right now? So about July 2020, I said, let's start a podcast. By the end of August, I had the microphone, the headphones, the software, and 4 interviews recorded. So right. It was very much like, I'm going to put my head down and I'm going to actually build this right now. I'm not going to wait. I'm not going to ask for permission.
I love that. For me, it was very similar because we have this, especially for me, I had a misconception, I guess, of what it takes to start a podcast, right? I thought I needed this great equipment, like best microphone, the best camera. And, you go down the rabbit hole on YouTube and there's like 400 videos of like, want to start a podcast? Use this camera and use this mic. And you watch 7 of them. I'm like, what the fuck am I supposed to use now?
Yeah.
And eventually you get past that and you're like, I just need to press record, right? Like jump on the Zoom and record and that's a podcast.
100%. Like I tell people you can start with what you have. If you have an iPhone, you can set up a tripod, record with that. If you have a laptop, your laptop has the webcam, you can start with that. So really ours was very simple. I got, $50 headphones, $50 microphone, and we spend $25 a month for our software. So you think the all-in cost is like nothing. You couldn't even run a Google ad campaign for what we're running the podcast for, right? And I think the other piece that was really intimidating from the outside was I know nothing about audio. I like listening to music. I like, listening on high-end speakers, but that doesn't make me an audio engineer. That doesn't mean I know what I'm talking about. So I was like, well, how do I edit a podcast? How do I record it? Can I learn all of those things by myself, right? And the example I'll give is, it's nothing like music editing or music mixing. It's literally listening to the episode, cutting out parts that don't make sense, cutting out the ums, cleaning up the background, and then publishing it. Probably takes me 2 hours to edit an episode. And these are long episodes. They're 50 minutes, 60 minutes, 70-minute episodes. It takes me about 2 hours. Self-taught. I wrote a little Notion doc on how to do it. And every single week we've been putting out episodes. And actually, to kind of plug some content that's coming out soon, I'm writing a blog post about the podcast, and it's called How I Published 52 Episodes in 52 Weeks. So the big thing for me is consistency, never taking a day off. I remember I got sick And I was running up against the time limit. And then I was like, I have to record. I called one of my best friends. I recorded him on Tuesday, released it Wednesday morning, right? So never miss a week. That's my motto.
I love that. So do you think, looking back, is consistency one of the things that you would recommend to someone that's starting a podcast as a main key to make it through?
100%. Like, so I'm a classic overthinker. I'm a classic perfectionist. And so I want everything to be polished. I mean, I'm sitting there and I'm agonizing. Should the timestamp be 19 minutes and 12 seconds or 19 minutes and 13 seconds, right? which is better? So what I end up doing is I build a process and a workflow. So like episode titles, I would get really hung up on. So I just said, we're standardizing them. It's revenue, the number of the episode, the person's name. That's the title, right? And we're just going to pump that content out. The descriptions, everything's a template. It's about the guest. It's about the topics, links to them, links to us, and then timestamps at the bottom. When I do posts, it's every post, I'm trying to pull out quotes that matter. I'm trying to pull out timestamps that matter. I'm trying to pull out topics that matter. And then I'm sharing those on social. So again, the key for me is building a process and a workflow and just running down that checklist and being like, okay, this is what it takes to make a good episode from my end. The other end I'll touch on, which I think a lot of people get hung up on. How do I get great guests on the show? Right?
Yep. I was going to ask about that.
Yeah. So for me, this was actually the easiest part. And I'd love to hear your experience as well. But I reached out to 20 people and 18 of them booked time on my calendar to record a 1-hour episode. I've never seen a 90% success rate from cold email, cold calls before, right? So there's a lot of people that want to talk. And what I've learned is you just got to do your homework and you have to pitch it in a way that they'll understand. So if I come to you and be like, hey, Marty, do you want to talk about content marketing? I'm a B2B CEO. You do B2B content marketing. Let's talk about that topic from our perspectives, right?
Right.
That's way more interesting than sending a template email that says, hey, I started a podcast. We don't have any episodes live, but I'd love for you to be on the show. You're like, this guy's no credibility. He didn't even read my LinkedIn. He doesn't know my website, right? Do a little bit of homework, send those cold emails. You're going to get responses. The fastest interview I ever booked was 5 minutes. 5 minutes. I sent a LinkedIn message. The person said, I'd love to. I sent them my calendar. They booked in 5 minutes. So top to bottom, 5 minutes to book 1 hour. So
where do you usually do the outreach on? Is it mostly cold email or do you use it on social, Twitter, LinkedIn as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I'm not a very active person on social media. Don't have Facebook, don't have Instagram, don't really do Twitter. I have my handle saved just so no one steals it, but I don't actually use it. But I am active on LinkedIn. And I think a big part of it is my personal network. So you think like, let's say you start a podcast when you're 25, you've been doing a bunch of cool stuff before. Your friends have interesting jobs. They work with other interesting people. So your personal network's a big one. But then you kind of outgrow that and you say, how do I interview the people that I want to be talking to? How do I use it as a network builder, right? So for me, LinkedIn's been a great source. And my LinkedIn strategy is very simple. I just follow people who put out amazing content. And then I don't ask them right away. I engage 2 or 3 comments, 2 or 3 posts. I might tag them in something. Hey, is this interesting to you? Is it relevant? Build that relationship for a few weeks, very lightly. Again, I've never spoken to them. I've never met them. And then you have the ask, and you make the ask simple. If you can't make the ask in 2 sentences, then it's not simple enough. So
I love that. That's good advice.
Yeah, and I have 2 asks. Sorry, just quickly, I have 2 asks here.
Sure.
One is, do you want to just book my podcast? And I do this all the time. I just be like, hey, do you want to book my podcast? It's 60 minutes. It's going to be great. And sometimes that works. Sometimes people are like, I don't know you, right? So then I soften the ask and I say, do you have 15 minutes to talk to me on the phone? I'd love to learn about your business, your philosophy, and maybe we'll have you on the show if it makes sense for you. So that's kind of the softer ask, and I found both approaches work. Ask for 15 minutes, convert that to a podcast, or just straight up ask for a podcast. And people that are busy, they'll just book on your Calendly, no problem.
Yeah, I think especially when your guests are CEOs or builders, like we all speak that same language, right? And I think speaking that same language in your outreach, it just makes it much easier. I think you were writing about this last week or so, of like the older you get in your career, the shorter your emails get, right? Like, don't send me a 10-paragraph email asking me to be in the podcast. Say, what do you want from me?
Yeah.
What's my next step? Right?
100%. I mean, my outbound to you, right? So I did not know you. I was just following you on LinkedIn. My outbound to you was like, Marty, I love your content. It's very authentic. It cuts through all the bullshit. Do you want to be on my podcast? This is what we do. And then when you read about the podcast, I literally have a sentence that says, we started this to cut through all the BS and PR. We do not interview people who aren't builders, right? And people are like, that resonates with them. Like, I'm a CEO trying to talk to other CEOs, and I'm very honest of I'm building this podcast in public, right? I'm not an audio engineer. I'm not a head of PR for 20 years who started a podcast, right? I'm literally in a room. That's my diploma on the floor right there. I'm literally just in a random room in the house, right? Like just doing this podcast. And I think that's the key is I am who I say I am. What you say, like what I say is what you get. And people think that's a weakness. That's really a strength. So like first-time founders, bootstrapped founders, you can build a network around you and be like, okay, I don't know anyone. Let's build a podcast about how I'm building my network in public, right? It doesn't have to be you're an expert, you have, an MBA from a great school, and that's the only time you can talk about finance, right? You're allowed to give kind of your opinion, and people want that authenticity to shine through.
Yeah, I think especially when you frame your content or your podcast, which is content at the end of the day, as in like, this is what I think, right? Like this is my opinion, this is what I'm learning, this is what's working for me, this is what's not working for me. When you're framing it and like, this is what works for everyone, I think you lose that back door of saying of personality, because when might work for you might not work for everybody. So I think that cuts through much better when you're putting out a podcast or content and you're framing that and like, this is me. It's not for everybody, might work for you, might not, but this is what works for me.
100%. I think the only thing I would add to that is people are so focused on what they're good at that they forget to talk about their mistakes, and the mistakes are what help other people. So literally, if you think like, why did I start this podcast? It's for Safa at 16. It's for me at 16, where I'm sitting in school and I'm like, high school stupid. I have to go to college. I have to finish, and I'm going to get a real job. I'm going to work in tech. I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to be great. But I don't have a game plan, right? And everything I'm hearing is from a 55-year-old CEO talking about, they're very media trained and they're talking about things very high level. Oh, we grew revenue 40%. Nobody ever asked them, how did you do that? How many people do you have? What's the quota for your sales team?
Right.
What's the relationship from marketing and sales? Right? How are you beating this competitor? How did you coach that employer, that executive? Right? Nobody goes into the details. So I'm literally building a podcast for the younger version of me. And that allows us to share all of our mistakes so that when younger people come along, when people earlier in their career come along, we can just say, hey, don't waste your time on all of this. Here are the mistakes I made. You can leapfrog past me and you can kind of catch up to where we are much sooner without going through all the hell and all the pain, right?
I love that. I frame it very similarly, just a bit differently. I frame it as, if I died and my son wanted to be an entrepreneur, what would he want? What I would want him to listen to, right? Yeah. And those are the episodes of, look, you're gonna face this, and then this is gonna happen, and then you're gonna have, this is how I dealt with it, or this is how this person dealt with it. And also the way I framed it from the very beginning, and I think it's in the description for the Podium Stories podcast still, is I hated normal public relations so much, like Forbes, like Inc., of how fucking perfection they showed. And like you were saying, they skipped through all the mistakes. And I think I put it as, it's like Forbes, but with cuss words. And
I read that the other day.
Yeah, and I'm like it's the real Forbes, right? Like Forbes is great, and we love to be there, but I want them to have the real Forbes of what's happening behind the scenes. Because when you talk to founders, no company is all rainbows all the time. So we want to talk about that, where most people don't talk about it. I had a question for you, Safa, about, so you're saying finding great guests is probably one of the parts that has come easier for you. I've had similar results on that. But what makes a great guest? So once you get them on the podcast, you're interviewing them, you're talking with them, what makes a great guest that's going to turn into a great episode? What do you want from the guests to know as they come in?
It's a really good question. I like guests that can speak in detail because I think detail helps the story move along. If I interview 5 software CEOs and I ask them the same questions, it's not that interesting because you end up in that position where like someone says you should raise a lot of money and someone says you should bootstrap. And then the audience is kind of left with like, well, what the hell do I do? Because I just listened to 3 weeks and they all contradicted each other, right? What I like doing is I like doing my homework before, and then I like picking guests who have really strong opinions on a specific topic and they can speak about it at length, right? So that's not to say that I agree with them, right? But I want to hear that story from them. And I think that really comes from someone who knows their stuff inside and out. And it sounds counterintuitive, but the best episodes are narrow and very deep, right? You and I talked for 2 hours about shame, guilt, imposter syndrome, self-doubt. Okay, that can't happen unless I create the space to say every episode does not need an action item. Every episode does not need actionable advice, because that's not realistic. You can't listen every week and I give you one nugget of information and then you move on with your life and you think everything's great. That's not what a company is, right? The freedom to say this week we're going to go deep on sales tactics and paying your salespeople the right way and commission structure, and the next week we're going to talk about psychological trauma that founders have. And so I can go deep on all those subjects. So it's a lot of me, but I think the key is letting the person speak about what they care about. Frankly, it's in the email. I ask people, I say, what's some topic that's close to your heart that you haven't spoke about lately? What's something that really bothers you that you haven't had a chance to tell? Like something you might vent to an employee or to a colleague, but something that you haven't really shared publicly. And people will say, oh, this thing really bothers me. And we'll just harp on that, right? So you do a little bit of background on that, a little bit of background on the episode, but then you just keep asking questions and giving them space to talk. To make that a little more tangible, I always have a script when I go into it. I'm going to ask them these questions to get started. I'm going to make sure I touch on these high-level topics. But that's just to get the conversation going. When the conversation's going, I back up and I say, why do you feel that way? Can you tell me more? Can you give me an example of when you felt that way? Right? And then you let them keep going. Don't treat it like a train that has to leave the station on time. You know, sometimes I don't even talk about what the script says. I just say, how are you? Thanks for joining the show. Can you tell us about your background? And then something about their background so interesting, it derails the whole conversation. So I think a great guest is someone who can speak in details about whatever topic. And I think the job of a host is to enable that, not to rush it and say, we have to get to topic number 3. This is not CNN and we don't have 22-minute time slots, right? It's let the conversation flow, keep pushing them because these people want to talk about these things. I've interviewed my closest friends and I've learned things on the podcast that I've never learned in 10 years of friendship because it's such a unique medium where I'm allowed to ask any level of depth that I want and people feel comfortable kind of reciprocating.
I love that. I think one of the things, looking back to our episode together on your show, that really stands out, like really, I've been, not that many, but probably 10, 15 interviews as a guest. And I think you've done the best job creating that environment for the guests to feel comfortable with sharing. And when I was on the guest in your podcast, I didn't really know your process to do that. Right. But it seems like you've kind of figured out a formula, and it's not written probably or anything like that, but it's or your skills to achieve that environment where the host feels really open to talk about anything, right? Because we were supposed to talk about content marketing.
Yeah, exactly.
And we didn't fucking talk about that.
No, yeah. Go ahead.
And I think you did a great job pre-podcast, right? With that email of what are some of the topics that are on your mind and you haven't talked about lately. And then with that on the podcast of just being able to ask the right questions, push the right buttons, and then have that sense of compassion and openness that I feel mostly when I'm in therapy, but I don't honestly feel when I'm on a podcast, right? I understand people have timelines and we have a meeting later and I have a meeting later. So you did a great way to put that into a place for me and others, it seems like other guests, to really expand on things that they usually don't have the chance to talk about.
Thank you. No, it really means a lot to hear that. That's really the goal here is like, I do a lot of work behind the scenes to make that happen. It's, can I read all of your LinkedIn posts, all your Twitter posts? Can I see the mutual connections that we have? Can I see if you have content of any sort, video, podcast, blog, can I read a couple of them? And again, not to memorize them, but just to be like, what are the themes? How does this person talk, right? And then I think there's that pre-interview where you and I are on the call, but I haven't pressed record yet. And it's going to be cut. But that's super important because I always tell people, I have an edit button. It's okay. There's no stakes. It's not live. It doesn't matter. If you don't like an answer, just be like, Safa, I don't like that. And I'm going to start over. And I'll say, okay, great. Like it's making everyone like lowering the expectations, right? And I'm very, very introverted and I hated talking on the phone. And I kind of was like, well, if I was interviewing myself, right? So if someone like me wanted to be on my show, how do I make them feel comfortable? And how do I just give them all the information they need so they can just come on the show and just be themselves instead of being like, does he really want to hear about my background, right? I've done 1.5 to 2 hour episodes and people will say, I felt like I was talking too much. And I was like, no, it's perfect, because as a content person, I need you to talk, and I might be able to trim it. But if you don't say something, I can't add that in post. Right. So yeah, thank you for saying that. It really means a lot.
No, absolutely. And that's one of the cheat codes I always talk about. When you're your own target audience, it makes everything so much easier. When you're an introverted CEO and you want to talk to builders, most of them are introverted. There's not that many extroverted builders, really. They might stand out, but the vast majority of us, I think, we're introverted. And you know how it feels to be on the other side of the table. And you can create that environment, and you can help them create the content that they need. And I think you did that tremendously well. As a final, there's a couple questions that I want to ask you. One of them is just more playful. If you could interview anyone, dead or alive, who would it be and why? What would be your ideal podcast guest?
Ideal podcast guest would be Marcus Aurelius. So Roman emperor, philosopher, very interesting person. So the emperor of Rome at that time, from my understanding, was like the president of the United States and the chief justice of the Supreme Court at the same time. They ran everything. Super interesting guy. I have to say that I was probably 15 or 16 when I was introduced to his writings. So my favorite book by him is Meditations.
Meditation is great.
Yeah, and my favorite part, again, to your point of the audience, it was never supposed to be a book. It was his personal journal that he wrote notes in daily. And then after he died, people found it and they published the parts that were intact. So you're getting an emperor's thought in the middle of a war. You're getting an emperor's thought in the middle of political, turmoil in Rome. And that's incredible. It really shaped the way I think, and it shaped my perspective on what matters in life. I'm a perfectionist and I tend to be a procrastinator because things aren't exactly the way I want. And you end up reading like, that's not what your life is about. If you're lucky, you have 80 years, right? And you literally have to wake up every day and make your life great. No one's going to do it for you. The other piece to it is you can't be like, okay, right now I'm going to be super out of shape. I'm going to eat whatever I want. I'm never going to go to the gym. But when I turn 30, I'm going to turn a switch and I'm just going to be awesome. Like, no, like who you are today is who you are. I say this thing very often. It's, what you think is who you are. That you cannot separate these. If you're negative all day, every day, guess what? You're a jackass. You're negative. Like, I'm sorry. There's no universe where like you're negative in your head and you're just a benevolent person and you're donating all this money to charity and you're volunteering your time. Like, that doesn't happen. And I think reading his work and works that were kind of inspired by him really helped me to be like, this is what matters in life. You really have to go all out because the risks they're larger in your head than they are in reality, basically.
I love that. It would be a great interview. And I know you have another podcast episode coming soon that it seems like it was a great one. Can you give us a bit more context on that new episode coming on Wednesday?
Yeah, absolutely. So podcast episode coming up this Wednesday, end of June. I talked to a former startup founder who left the company that he co-founded on his own. They didn't run out of money. He left by his own volition and got a job at a Fortune 500 building products there. And we talked very openly about the perception of startups, what it's like from the outside, what the media portrays, what founders portray publicly, and then what it's actually like to be in a startup. And I think the real key that him and I talk about at length is there are so many decisions in the early days, and frankly, almost none of them matter. What it boils down to is, can you build an audience first? And then can you build a product for that audience? And if you can do that, you'll be doing great. It doesn't matter if it's software, hardware, e-commerce, consulting services, doesn't matter. Build the audience, talk to them, ask them 100 questions, just keep going, figure out everything you can, then build the product that they want. Don't build the product because you're a genius and then hope and pray that there are people on the other side of it who want it.
I love that. Sounds like it's going to be a great episode. Safa, I really appreciate you coming in. This was a great episode for us, man. I personally want to thank you for coming in.
Yeah, absolutely, Marty. Thank you so much for your time. You've been a huge help to me. I've really enjoyed our conversations back and forth. Anything I can do to help you, please let me know.
Likewise. And this is it, folks. We're going to post a link below with Safa's podcast, Safa's company. Check him out. We'll publish this on LinkedIn as well. With a few posts and videos. Safa, once again, thank you so much for being here, man.
Thank you, man. Take care.
Cheers.